Good afternoon and welcome to our third webinar for the STEM Teachers Without Borders project. My name is Dr. Francois Nordia and I'm the community manager for the project, and it is my absolute privilege to welcome so many teachers who are using the second day of the fourth term to join us for some professional development, but more importantly, to add their voice to a very important topic. You would see that we've advertised today's event as Pathogenic Pedagogy, which was just a little bit of a play on words, because during today's session, later on, Dr. Jaco Bezuidenhout is going to share with us the Kirby-Bauer technique. And it's one way in which we can bring Western science and Indigenous knowledge together in the classroom. So we're looking forward to that. And during that session, the Kirby-Bauer technique, there would be a big focus on pathogens or bacteria that's going to be part of it. So really looking forward to today's discussion. Before I get into today's program, just can I ask, because of course my online insecurities creep up and I don't want to be talking into the void. So if you can do me a favor, you'll see on your right-hand side, there's a chat box that says, say something nice. Would you mind using that space and just sharing your favorite emoji? And we can get this Mexican wave of emojis going, just so that I know at least that people on the other side are currently hearing me and that we don't have any technical difficulties with the start of our event, because it would be extremely sad if I were to talk into the void. So waiting patiently for those emojis to come through. Of course, I'm also on WhatsApp on the background with our other colleagues who's part of our panel today, just so that they can let me know in case things go wrong. But of course, we hope that that won't be the case. Great, I'm seeing 2 emojis coming through. That means at least 2 other people can hear me, but it would be great. If you don't want to share an emoji, that's also okay. Maybe just say hi in the comments and where you're currently tuning in from. It would be a great indicator for us also where in the country or where in the world even people are joining us this afternoon. Then you'll see next to the Say Something Nice box, you'll see there is an Ask a Question button, and I'm going to ask you that if you have any questions, you are more than welcome to pop your questions in the Ask a Question tab, because there will be, during our question and answer session at the end, we are going to answer your questions as they pop up in the Ask a Question section. And then, of course, if you like somebody else's question, you can just upvote it, because the more upvotes a question gets, the more it filters to the top, and then, or shall I say, precipitates to the top, and then we'll be able to answer those more engaging questions, or the burning questions from the audience. We'd be able to answer it there. So before we start, just from my side, the Teachers Without Borders project is housed within the Northwest University's self-directed learning research focus area. And I'm very privileged to work with Professor Josef as well as Professor Neal Petersen, who are the primary investigators within this project, and they will be sharing a lot of information with us today. But just to share with you the 2 aims of this project. Firstly, that the project aims to broaden the Indigenous knowledge base within South Africa. We know that it is an area that is lacking, not only in South Africa, but all over the world, but that there's a challenge in teachers accessing Indigenous knowledge and also not knowing exactly how to incorporate that in their lessons. That's why sessions like today and other professional development sessions are available, that teachers can get hold of these the knowledge base of Indigenous knowledge. I think I'm going to say knowledge so many times in one sentence, but it's important for us that we broaden the base of Indigenous knowledge, and this is done through action research within specific communities in our country. But then the second aim is to create this community of practice, and this is a very new part of the project, where we are creating this community of practice where teachers can come together and share their knowledge on Indigenous knowledge, where we'll create a platform where we can share our stories with each other. Because we know the challenge is a teacher is typically isolated and alone in the classroom, teaching to a diverse classroom. And teachers don't necessarily have all of the Indigenous knowledge from specific cultural groups. So it would be great to form a community of practice where we can give a voice to as many cultural bodies or as many indigenous knowledge systems as we possibly can. And right off the bat, this has sparked a very needed and valid conversation on social media as we advertise this event. And it's important to note that even though all 4 of our presenters today will be male and will be majority white, this is not the intent of this project. This is the start of our project. And we would much rather want a platform when we can get a diverse group of people together to share Indigenous knowledge. So I thought before we do our entire webinar today, let's address that and let's acknowledge that and note that this is not the way in which we want this to happen. We'd much rather want the voice of so many other people and diverse people sharing their knowledge and thereby increasing the base of Indigenous knowledge. So that's from my side, but I would like to much rather hand over to my colleagues who have got immense experience in the field of Indigenous knowledge systems. And our first speaker for today, if I can just run us through the agenda, our first speaker today would be Professor Josef de Beer, who is going to share with us why we should include Indigenous knowledge in the science curriculum. That will be followed by a demonstration of the Kirby-Bauer technique. That would be hosted by or presented by Dr. Jaco Bezuidenhout. And then lastly, we are going to finish off with a discussion exactly on the points that I just mentioned, where Professor Neal Petersen will then use the Bono's hats method in allowing all of us who are part of this conversation today to discuss the exact issues around Indigenous knowledge. And then lastly, we are going to finish off with a question and answer session. So once again, make sure that you do ask your questions in the Ask a Question section. Before I hand over to Professor de Beer, I would like to ask everybody, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, there's a teal or a turquoise or a blue little button that says, be notified on WhatsApp. For now, the community is operating on WhatsApp. We have got a WhatsApp service that we would like everybody to take part in, and you will be receiving your notifications on our following events and the platforms that we'll be building on bringing our community together. So it would be great that if you're not part of our WhatsApp service yet, be sure to click on the Be Notified on WhatsApp, and you will, if you'll send your name to that number, you will be added to our database. It is not a WhatsApp group. Your details is safe. You won't be spammed with memes. You will definitely just be receiving the notifications of the community of practice. So, and if you'd like to know the number off by heart, I'm going to put it in our chat as well. But our number is +27 78 343 6534. I'll just repeat that. That is +27 783 436 534. As soon as Professor de Beer starts, I will be putting that into the chat for those that like to join on that way. But it now gives me immense pleasure to introduce to you Professor Josef de Beer. Josef has just completed a second PhD on Indigenous knowledge systems, focusing specifically on the anthropological and ethnobotanical perspectives of Khoisan knowledge in the Karoo. He is also the editor of an OASIS research book entitled The Decolonization of the Curriculum Project, The Affordances of Indigenous Knowledge for Self-Directed Learning. Based on Josef's work on Indigenous knowledge, he received the NRF's Excellence in Science Engagement Award in 2019. And it now gives me great pleasure to invite onto screen Professor de Beer. And of course, just as I mentioned that, I would see that he disconnected, but I'm sure he'll reconnect with us soon. You'll reconnect us. Now, while we do that, let me post on our WhatsApp number into the chat. It's interesting how things like this happen. You can prep as much as you want, but as soon as the event starts, then the gremlins pick in. So let me try and unmute him and open his video. There we go. Professor De Beer, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Francois. Welcome, dear colleagues. I want to start, and those of you that have attended our previous webinars, please excuse me. But as you then know, my favorite quote is by a CEO in the motor industry. His name was Jaco, and he said, "In a perfectly rational society, the best of us will be teachers, and the rest have to settle for something less. Because passing civilization from one generation to the next is the highest honor and the highest responsibility a person could have." So I always so enjoy, it's the highlight of my work to work with teachers. So thank you for really logging into this session this afternoon. And I really hope we're going to have a good discussion. So welcome to all of you. Now, I've been working in the field of Indigenous knowledge probably for the last 10 years or so. And the first thing that some of you might wonder is, now, what does a old white man has to offer in terms of Indigenous knowledge? And I think that's a very valid question. And you know, the license I think that I have to do this work is that I've done a master's and a PhD on Indigenous knowledge systems. And not all of it. You know, I don't think there's a person who can claim that they really know South African Indigenous knowledge. My focus was on Khoisan Indigenous knowledge in the Karoo, and I think that is really my area of specialization. But I think the challenge for us is we sit with diverse learners in our classrooms, and we need the pedagogies so that all the learners from different backgrounds, whether they are Indian learners that has Ayurveda's background, or Xhosa Indigenous knowledge, Zulu Indigenous knowledge, for Europeans, maybe Dutch or French Indigenous knowledge. How can we bring this as a collective and really make science more meaningful and relevant to diverse learners? And this is why I really would like diverse views and discussions today for us as teachers. So, Francois, we can move on, please. Francois, you can move the slides for us, please.
That's it. We've moved on.
Yes.
There we go.
Francois, can you move the slides for us? My apologies, colleagues. It seems to me we have a bit of gremlins.
Josef, I just moved on. Can you hear me there?
I still see Indigenous knowledge in the natural, physical, and life sciences class on my screen.
I have moved on the slides. Let's just see if somebody in the comments can just tell us what slides they are currently seeing.
Okay, Francois, let me refresh then, because I still see the cover slide. Francois, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Ons kan, Prof, jy kan aangaan.
Kan ek aangaan? The question we need to ask ourselves, because many teachers ask, is there a clash between Western science and Indigenous knowledge, or traditional healing for that matter? And many people think, okay, we can't really link Indigenous knowledge with the tenets of science, because we all know as science teachers that there's certain characteristics of science. It is objective, it is inferential, and many people have this idea that Indigenous knowledge means that ancestors are consulted, and it's pseudoscience in some people's minds. And what we want to show you today is that there's really an overlap between some tenets of indigenous knowledge and some tenets of science. Thank you, Francois. We can move on. So we very often see this in the newspapers of people that are cut up for muti. You can move on, Francois. And then in the process, we forget that many traditional healers, for instance, follow the scientific method. They make careful observations, they formulate hypotheses, they make predictions, they have certain stringent methodologies, they collect their results, and they come to certain conclusions. Thanks, Francois. So we all know as science teachers that, there's huge responsibilities on our shoulders as science educators. We know that we don't perform too well in international benchmark tests like the Trends in Mathematics and Science Studies, or PISA. And, if you really consult literature, we know that there's many reasons for it. And you will know there are some of your colleagues maybe who are less qualified than you are, who do not always have the necessary content knowledge that we have. Many teachers teach in under-resourced schools. We have this CAPS curriculum that is so comprehensive, and you always wonder, but where am I finding time to really infuse indigenous knowledge in such a packed curriculum? Thanks, Francois. But I think what we sometimes also forget is that one of the huge problems is that we do not always pay justice to the effective domain in education, because we so focus on content knowledge and we don't have a choice because we need to prepare our learners for the exam. But sometimes I wonder, do learners really enjoy science? Do they come into the classroom with excitement and enthusiasm? And I think indigenous knowledge really provides us with a vehicle to make science relevant, that the kids can see the link between the world in which they live, everyday society, and science. So what we suggest in this project is that indigenous knowledge can really address the effective domain by showing children the alignment between our everyday lives and our cultural backgrounds and science. Thank you, Francois. Now, just that we are all on the same wavelength. What is indigenous knowledge? It is a dynamic, living system that changes. It can be applied to problem solving because indigenous knowledge holders try to solve everyday problems for their survival. It is very often transmitted orally and encapsulated in metaphor, and therefore it's really at risk. It can really get lost because of the fact that it's not always published. Sometimes it is embedded in ethics and spirituality and metaphysics, and that is a problem because we feel that, science is objective and rational, and now we come with, there's also this metaphysical aspect to indigenous knowledge. It is holistic. So when you go to a traditional healer, for instance, they're not just going to focus on the physical problem you have, but also at emotional issues that might cause this disease. It is ecologically based and contextualized. Thank you, Francois. Now, there's many indigenous knowledge systems. I had the privilege a few years ago to go with one of my Indian PhD students to Kerala, where we studied Ayurveda. Absolutely amazing. I can recommend it. Thanks, Francois. And then, of course, there are Chinese and Eastern medicine like acupuncture. And then on the next slide, the strong focus, of course, in our classroom should be traditional healing and African indigenous knowledge systems. Thank you, Francois. Now, if you ever have a chance, those of you that are living in Josie, please go and visit the My Bazaar. It's a muti market in Johannesburg on the corner of Anderson and Berea Street. Fascinating experience. Thanks, Francois. Now, a question. I don't want to talk all the time. Who of you can tell me what this is? And the person who is correct are going to receive this beautiful book, People's Plants. It's the indigenous knowledge of different cultural groups in South Africa that we're going to send you free and mahala by courier. So let me hear. In the little comments box, just post if you know what is showed there on the slide. Renel, I see you say the emperor moth. The answer is incorrect. Kerry-Ann, yes, it is a moth, but I want a more specific. Sylvia, Mupani worm moth. Please send Francois your address. It is the Mupani worm. Thank you. Sylvia, you are correct. Francois, you can move on. It's an insect with a complete metamorphosis. You can move on, Francois. The point that I want to make, dear colleagues, is, in primary school, we often look at the silkworm as an example of an insect with a complete metamorphosis. And we actually ignore the Mupani worm Imbrasia bellina, which also has a complete metamorphosis and which is of huge economic importance, especially in the Limpopo province. So what I want to share with you is sometimes indigenous knowledge can be used in the form of relevant examples rather than a Western curriculum. Thank you, Francois. Okay, another book that I want to give away. What is this on the picture? This one is easy. Let's see if we get responses. Yeah, it's delicious. Marula, Nikki, you are right. Nikki, you were the first one who answered the marula. So please also send Francois your address. You can move on, Francois. Colleagues, we all know that in the life sciences curriculum, we look at anaerobic fermentation. And marulas is a lovely example that we can use to actually illustrate this process. Yes, I see all of you know the marula. Francois, we can move on. Thank you. Now, it all started for me with an ethnobotanical project in the Hantam. Thanks, Francois. Move on. And what we basically did is we had a mobile herbarium of plants that we showed to participants. Thanks, Francois. And basically, we asked people, and this is a beautiful project that you can do with your learners, that they do a survey in your community to see under grandfather and grandmother and knowledgeable people, what knowledge do people still have of local plants? What did they use for medicines? What did they eat? What did they use for arts and crafts? And I know in Mexico, this is huge in schools where kids do lovely projects based on ethnobotany. Thank you, Francois. Now, you can move on. So this is just pictures of how we did the work. Now, what we, for instance, recorded is, this is called Woodia gordoni, the garp. And this plant has traditionally been used by the San people when they went hunting. Now, they had to sometimes run for hours on end chasing animals because they were hunters. And they lived in the Kalahari and in the Karoo where it's dry, so they didn't have water. And they realized that if you eat this plant, it does two things. It, first of all, give you water, because 90% of Woodia consists of water. And secondly, it suppresses your appetite. In other words, you can really go for days without eating. Now, just to show you also the link between indigenous knowledge and commercialization in Western pharmaceutical contexts, Pfizer then wanted to make tablets to help people to diet. Now, if you look at me, you can see that clearly Woodia is not going to help for you to lose weight. Otherwise, I would have been trim and slim. So the tablets don't work. And they've realized that when you actually chew this plant, it does help for you to suppress your appetite and to eventually lose weight. The moment they make tablets, it becomes ineffective. And they've realized you actually need to chew it in your mouth, and then it actually works on the neurotransmitters in the brain, which suppresses your appetite. So this just shows you what a potential there is in future with our wonderful flora that we have in the country, that there's such a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities for learners, and this is something you can explore in the classroom. Thank you, Francois. This is the famous cancer bush. And it's used for backache, for stomach problems, for kidneys, diabetes, high blood pressure, colds, bladder problems. You can actually buy it in Dis-Chem today, and it helps for certain forms of diabetes. And the point I wanted to make is the Zulu and Khoisan indigenous knowledge holders and healers knew this for hundreds of years. And now Western science has actually confirmed this knowledge. And it just shows you that there's such a lot of validity in this indigenous knowledge, and it's now actually confirmed by Western science. Thanks, Francois. Many of you will know this plant. It is Wynrite, Ruta graveolens, used for colds and headache. Thanks, Francois. This is an interesting plant that is very important in sun culture. It's called the poison bulb, and they use these bulbs to treat asthma. They put it on the chest. But also important is, this is a plant that we believe the San people used when they went into a trance dance, because it's highly poisonous. So if you just eat a small amount, it actually helps you to go into a very spiritual state, where you actually lose contact with reality. And they claim that, you know, then they can make contact with the spiritual world. But if you eat too much, it's deadly. It's absolutely fatal. Thank you, Francois. Now, a practical example that you can do in the classroom is simple chromatography, where you can actually extract some of these alkaloids, because most of these medicinal properties of plants has to do with the alkaloids in it. So very nice, simple little experiment that you can do in the classroom. Thanks, Francois. You can move through the next two slides quickly. This is just, I'm not going to focus on chromatography due to a lack of time. Another example is the Kirby-Bauer technique that Jaco is going to do shortly, so we can skip this slide as well. I just wanted to give a placeholder of where this would fit in. Now, colleagues, this is important. We need to realize that there's overlap between indigenous knowledge and the nature of science. Both are empirical, both are tentative, both are inferential, both are creative knowledge systems, both are socially and culturally based. But a big difference is that science is reductionistic, because we break complex phenomena down in order to understand it, whereas indigenous knowledge is holistic. So you try and look at the whole and not break it down into parts. Thanks, Francois. Now, I believe that a good pedagogy, when you explore indigenous knowledge systems in the class, is problem-based learning. So it should be learner-centered, and you will see that when Jaco is going to talk to you. It should be done in small groups. You are not the sage on the stage, you're the guide on the side, you're a facilitator. Try and provide authentic problems that guide the learning process. Discovery learning is stops, and don't underestimate the role of self-directed learning. So let the kids go and explore and set learning goals for themselves. Thanks, Francois. Now, I want to give you a few practical examples of activities based on indigenous knowledge. And the first one, you will know that in the Western Cape, in the fynbos, you sometimes need a veld fire for some plants' seeds to germinate. Now, in Australia, there is a cultural group called the Noongar people, and they were the first people who realized that before they plant their crops, they expose the seeds to smoke, because they've realized it's actually a component in the smoke that let seeds germinate better. And scientists have realized that it's actually carrageen, which is also an alkaloid that actually stimulates seed germination. So carrageen was then derived from karik, which is the Noongar word for smoke. And this is a nice hands-on activity that you can do in the classroom. Thank you, Francois. You can move on, please. Now, I love shoestring science, because I understand that many of you might be working in a class that do not have well-equipped laboratories. So here you see you can use charcoal or briquettes to actually provide smoke. Use an old coffee tin. You put a net at the top, and then I tried this with several seeds, but bean seeds, Phaseolus vulgaris, bean seeds is stops. And then you have a classical experiment in a control group. And this is problem-based learning, so you shouldn't give a recipe to the kids. Let them, in groups, design an experiment to test whether seeds germinate better when they are exposed to smoke. And then they can go and really try their design and actually physically do it. So what I've done is I've exposed in the experimental group the seeds to smoke using briquettes. The experiment of the control group, of course, are seeds that were not exposed to smoke. And the next slide is going to show you the results. On day 9, on the left, you see the seeds, the control seeds that were not exposed to smoke. On the right-hand side, you see the experimental seeds that were exposed to smoke. And clearly, you can see that there's better germination. And now there's lots of dependent and independent variables. For instance, you can't use cigarettes for the smoke, because then you bring in another factor, which is nicotine. You can go and look at different seeds. Are there differences between different seeds? Are some seeds more sensitive to smoke than others? So the sky's the limit. Thank you, Francois. Yes, you are definitely going to get the slides, Kerry, and I see your note and comment now. We've already dealt with this, Francois. I'm not going to, in this, for the sake of time, dwell on this. Now, a second example. Now we're going to China. The Chinese has a practice of burning incense in closed rooms with pears. So they actually harvest the pears when it's still green and not ready to be consumed. And then they burn incense, and incense releases ethylene gas. Now, ethylene gas is also a plant hormone that actually stimulates growth. And the Egyptians also realized this. And if you wound a fig, or, you know, if there's a apple and you scar it, you know that it becomes spoiled so much easier. And the reason for that is ethylene gas is released. And this ethylene gas actually let fruit ripens earlier, and it also leads to cell senescence, that it gets spoiled. Now, the question is, how can we test that in the lab? My cat decided she wants to join the seminar. Thank you, Francois. So once again, let the kids think of experimental designs. You don't give them the answer. This is problem-based activities. And, you know, here you can really do what in primary school is a very common activity. Put seeds between layers of cotton wool, keep it moist, and look at germination. But then you can actually expose different seeds to different treatments. For instance, use a piece of apple or a piece of banana, which actually releases ethylene gas, and you put that in the container. And then you actually can see, compared to the control seeds, do you get better germination when you expose seeds to additional ethylene that is released by this decaying fruit? Thank you, Francois. And once again, there is bean seeds, the control, on day 7, some germination, where seeds were put in containers where there's also a piece of apple that releases additional ethylene gas. You can see there's far better germination. Thank you, Francois. Another problem that and I actually thought that we should discuss it, but I see I'm running out of my 20 minutes, so I'm going to just share it with you. You know that the biggest floral market is probably in Aalsmeer in Holland, in Amsterdam. Now, when they pick these flowers, it need to first go to the airport at Schiphol in Amsterdam. But the moment you cut the flower, this flower starts to wilt, because the moment you cut a flower, ethylene gas is released that leads to cell senescence. The cell starts to die. And now you need to realize it first needs to go to the airport in trucks, then it needs to get onto a jet or a Boeing. Then it does a 10-hour trip to New York or to Johannesburg to the flower market. Then at the flower market, it needs to be sold. Then only it goes to a florist. So 3 days later, you know, these flowers are not going to necessarily look good anymore. So the Dutch have developed a lot of insight on how you can prolong the post-harvest physiology of cut flowers. And this is indigenous knowledge. And I use this example to show us, when we talk about indigenous knowledge, we shouldn't just focus, colleagues, on African indigenous knowledge. And there's beautiful African indigenous knowledge. We need to realize indigenous knowledge is true of all cultures. So, Francois, you can move on. What causes flowers to wilt? A nice question for your kids to first discuss. It's ethylene gas, of course. And how can we possibly prolong the shelf life of flowers? Thanks, Francois. Now, you will see that in literature, there's a lot of ideas. Now, one is that you can administer silver thiosulfate STS because it slows down senescence, because it actually inhibits the work of ethylene gas. And then there's wonderful ideas on the internet. You can put the flowers in alcohol. Vodka works well, they claim. You can put some bleach in the water with the flowers. You can put a copper coin in the water, they say. You can add some sugar. You can add some soda. You can put the flowers in a fridge, cold treatment under low temperatures. Now that works, but what is the sense of buying flowers and putting it in the fridge? Every time you go and get food for 10 seconds, you admire your flowers. So the question is, how can we test this in the classroom? Thank you, Francois. So kids can try and design an experiment to teach this Dutch indigenous knowledge on the post-harvest shelf life of flowers. Beautiful expo project. Thank you, Francois. And this is something that Neal and I have done. So we took roses and we subjected the roses to different treatments, STS, JIC, sugar, and we wanted to see what effect it has. Thank you, Francois. And on day 13, you will see the results. Compared to the control, that wilted little flower, we've realized the two best treatments was temperature, where we put the flowers in the refrigerator, and then STS. So you can actually buy some STS and actually let the kids test this. So this is just practical examples of indigenous knowledge and how you can utilize it in the classroom. And there's many examples. I just chose 3 to whet your appetite. Thank you, Francois. So colleagues, I'm going to stop here. I want to conclude my session before Jaco takes over, and then we're going to end with Neal looking at the bonus thinking hats. The challenge is we can either pay lip service to indigenous knowledge by, when we do medicinal plants, say yes, Hoodia and the cancer bush are examples of indigenous knowledge plants that cultures have used for medicinal reasons for hundreds of years. But we don't engage learners really then in the processes of science. And our plea is that you structure learning activities like the 3 examples I've showed you, where kids are actually going to do experimental designs. They're going to physically do investigations in the lab or in the classroom. And in the process, they're going to validate the beauty of indigenous knowledge. And I really think that's the way to go. Thank you, Francois. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Professor De Beer. And I think one of the important things we need to realize here is that these were examples of what can be used in the classroom. But one of the most amazing things you can do is opening it up to your learners so that they bring their indigenous knowledge into the classroom, in letting them explore their own cultures. And I love what's happening in the chat section, where we are sharing ideas of how we can have driving questions that won't just almost want to say from a top-down perspective, force ideas on kids, but that they bring into the classroom from their own culture and from their own beliefs. So thank you to everybody that is engaging in the chat. It's amazing to see what you're doing. And then, of course, Sylvia and Nikki, congratulations on winning your copies of the People's Plant book. It would be amazing if you can just send me a WhatsApp to our WhatsApp number. If you click on the button at the bottom, or you'll see I'll put it in the chat again. Just send me a WhatsApp on our service and I'll be able to get your details and then send that through to you so that we can get the books delivered to you. And then, of course, the slides will be shared, as well as the recording of this will be available. You can use exactly the same link you used to access today. You'll be able to get the recording, but I'll also send out an email to all of our participants with the PDF version of the slides so that we can do this in the classroom. Right, our next speaker today is Dr. Jaco Bezuidenhout. He is a senior lecturer and a researcher in microbiology who has a passion for education. He has, over the past few years, presented several workshops and sessions for teachers on microbiology topics in the classroom, some also related to Indigenous knowledge. Looking forward to this presentation on the Kirby-Bauer technique from Dr. Jaco.
Okay, good day everybody. So I'm going to keep the presentation relatively short. I would love to leave my time for questions at the end. So I'm just quickly going to introduce a few key concepts. Share screen. Let's go for the entire screen then. Okay, so the first thing I just want to briefly touch on is, if you look at this little timeline of antibiotic development, the golden years was about between the 1960s and 70s, where the majority of commonly used antibiotics were discovered/developed. But the worrying trend you see at this stage now is post-2000. This discovery of new compounds tend to taper down quite a lot, and coupled with that, antibiotic resistance is becoming a problem. So in science, we need to move beyond the old types of exploration and technologies. So one method, for example, if you discover a new compound, either from a unique organism or a unique plant, you want to see, does it even have an effect? Is it worth exploring further? And there are basically two exploratory tests you can do. The one is disc dilution, and the second one being dilution technique. So I'm just briefly going to cover the dilution technique. It's a bit of a cumbersome method, whereas disc diffusion, I will slow down and expand there. So typically with the disc dilution, you more or less have a known concentration of the compound, so you can actually establish a concentration range. And basically, you look for growth versus non-growth to determine where the compound's effective concentration is. So typically where you see a cloudy well, that means growth occurred. So at that concentration, it's not inhibiting an organism, and the moment the cells or wells goes opaque or clear, the organisms have been killed down. But this is rather cumbersome, especially if you want to try to do it in a class type of environment. Which brings us to disc diffusion. So it's, in the simplest term, you just basically use an agar plate with a known compound or an organism of interest, and then impregnate a disc with an active compound, for example, a plant extract or a pure form of a certain compound, which you want to compare it to. And basically, if this compound does indeed display antimicrobial activity, you will see this halo developing around the disc as an indication that the organism cannot grow in the presence of a certain concentration of that compound. This is typically how it will look in a lab. The halos are quite clear to see for some compounds, whereas with some of the discs on the plate, there's no effect. And this is expected for some antibiotics. So how do we do this in a lab or in a classroom with some provisions? Is you have some test organisms, typically E. coli or Bacillus species, and antibiotic discs. You can use this as a reference, or you can just skip to the various compounds of interest. Now, these compounds you can derive from either plant material you, for example, mixed up in a mortar and pestle, or even slices of the plant itself, or for example, if it's a dry product, you can make this steep as described by the healer, and then impregnate the disc with that compound. So long story short, the first step is typically preparing a bacterial lawn. This will give us a, if you have no disc on it, a lawn of bacteria that's basically unhindered in their growth. And then in your second step, you place your discs of interest or your compounds of interest onto this plate, and then basically allow overnight for incubation to occur. And then the next day, you note your results. So for this demonstration, I had to do a bit of work beforehand. So I actually prepared 3 organisms, and I will show the plates and some of the key steps to you if you're interested. For reference purposes, I included 2 known antibiotics, but also from the garden I obtained some leaves of Bulbinella and Chrysula as test compounds. And this is where, for example, you can ask your pupils to either pick plants that for some reason might be regarded as potentially medicinal, or based on the indigenous knowledge is used as medicinal, to include in this demonstration or exercise. So like I said before, Bulbinella on the left, Chrysula on the right. A simple extract, like I said, mortar and pestle, and I used a simple filter paper disc you punch out and sterilize. We should just simply dip into that solution and then transfer it onto the plate. And then after overnight incubation, you get something like this. Okay. So if you look at the first test organism, you can see the one antibiotic did in fact show an effect, and one of the plant extracts showed an effect as well. And if I believe correctly, it's Chrysula that showed an effect against Bacillus. E. coli showed no effect against any of the plant extracts except the one antibiotic at the top. And which was this? This one is supposed to be Staphylococcus. And you can see there's a slight inhibition there. So, but what's important to remember with plant extracts is because it's not pure, it doesn't have a concentrated version of the compound, so it will inhibit the organism for a short while, and then it will grow over again. So the halo is not as developed as with antibiotics or pure antibiotics, but you do see that inhibition did occur at some stage. So this is just very briefly going over that. And like I said before, this afternoon, simple preparation in a mortar and pestle, and simple filter disc. This is plain filter paper you use, and you just simply use a fine tweezer to impregnate the disc, and then at the end of it, you end up with a plate that looks like this. So there's a lawn of bacteria on this surface, and then your compounds of interest can be included into these discs. And just to show you, those aren't old photos. Here are the plates I used for the presentation. It's just a bit tricky to see the halos because some overgrowth seem to occur. But this is in reality how simple the Kirby-Bauer method can actually be. Okay. Like I said, this is a bit of a fast journey through the topic, but I'm open to questions or discussions. I can also show specific steps if you require more detail on that. I just can't repeat the entire protocol within the time limit.
Thank you very much, Jaco. I think what's very important here is that the Kirby-Bauer technique is a way for us to visualize the effect that plants could have on a microbial level. So for kids in the classroom, it becomes a very engaging activity to do, for the mere fact that it's not only hands-on, but it becomes such a visible aspect of the curriculum. So when we do have, from a medicinal point of view, indigenous knowledge plants or plants from indigenous cultures, we can use that to showcase, you know what, that even if you think that from a Western perspective, we've got pills and tablets that work in on bacteria, the plants that grow in your garden or in your area can be used for the same effect.
And you can actually simulate this experiment with simple spices. One of the most interesting experiments we do with our students is we pick a common set of pathogens, but then we supplement this plates with spices, cinnamon, chilies, and everything. And it's also a very nice and easy demonstration to show how, for example, something as common as spices can also have antimicrobial effects. In fact, there's one article we do share with the students where if you look at India as a continent, as you move higher up in the latitudes, it tends to get warmer, so food will obviously spoil much sooner or be more susceptible to foodborne infections. But as you go higher and the ambient temperature rises, so is the spice content of the food typically, because those chili type spices can act as a preservative. So it's a nice, interesting trend to show. So it allows you to bring science to the classroom with something that should be actually quite relatable to students.
And what I love about this is the integration that can happen in between different subjects. Where if you have consumer studies, I know Dr. Audrey is in the audience. I saw her as well, Dr. Detoy from consumer studies, consumer sciences. There's an overlap between the subjects here. So there's a definite way in which you can use the Kirby-Bauer technique in food preservation, and as well as what Professor De Beer said with the cut flowers. I don't know whether there's any questions specifically on the Kirby-Bauer technique or how you would use that, but you're welcome to pop that in the chat pod, or you can just go and ask a question if you've got a specific question on the Kirby-Bauer technique. Then we'll answer that also during the Q&A at the end. But for now, Dr. Bezuidenhout, thank you very much for your time and for just showing us an example of this. We'll see you soon during the Q&A section again.
Pleasure.
Thank you, colleagues. That then brings us to the part of our session that is all about discussing the impact and the necessity of our just getting my second screen ready, of Indigenous knowledge in the classroom. And I'd like to put Professor Neal Petersen on stage. He is the Deputy Director for the School of Mathematics, Science and Technology Education at the Northwest University. He's got 30 years of experience in teaching life science on school and tertiary level. His research focus the past 5 years has been on researching the integration of Indigenous knowledge to contextualize life sciences content. It gives me great pleasure to put Professor Neal Petersen on stage. And once again, exactly the same thing happened. Prof. Petersen, if you wouldn't mind just refreshing your browser like we did during the rehearsal for this, because once again, exactly the same thing happened. So while Prof. Petersen is refreshing his feed, oh, there we go. He's on. There we go. Thank goodness. Thank you, Professor. I am going to leave you on stage and then share our slides.
Thank you, Francois. And good afternoon, colleagues. This is a wonderful opportunity to talk about the value that Indigenous knowledge might have for science teaching. Thanks for all the comments in the commentary box. I think you asked very valid questions. And during this discussion, please feel free to ask more questions, and in your comments also provide some answers or your opinion with regard to Indigenous knowledge. So the purpose of this is a discussion on can we actually use Indigenous knowledge as a vehicle to contextualize science content and make it more relevant to the learner. So that's an overall question that we want to ask. What is the relevance? Is it viable or not? And to facilitate this question, we will use the Bono thinking aids. So it is a teaching learning method where you look at the same question from different perspectives. And in that way, when you use it in your class, you can actually develop your learners' critical thinking skills, and they will be able to listen to others' ideas, opinions, make a point, and actually say why they actually believe in whatever they said. So based on also on some of the comments made on social media, think of questions while we go through this. Whose Indigenous knowledge should we teach? That's a burning question. And it's also relevant in terms of some of the comments you made. Is it a black thing? I think some of you also mentioned that it's not that. So I think we need to look at these while we work through the heads. Who should lead Indigenous knowledge discussions? Because some of the comments made, the argument goes around, is Is it only black people that can do that? That actually linked to the second bullet. Is it a black thing? So who should lead these discussions and be scholars of indigenous knowledge? And what will your role be as a teacher? And of course, we will look at the value that it has for the learners. Thank you, Francois. So we will go through head by head. But please, this will be an interactive session. So you will ask your questions and I will facilitate it, and some of the other people will also make some comments, some other facilitators. So the first head is the white head. And that is all about the facts. What is the real thing? What is the facts around information? So please start to type in your knowledge that you have based on indigenous knowledge. What is the information, the facts, the proof? What information do we have? If you can ask questions about it, where can I get the information? So please feel free to give some of your answers. So I will wait a few seconds. In Prof. Josef's presentation, he mentioned that indigenous knowledge is holistic. It's culturally and socially bounded, and that's some of the tenets of indigenous knowledge, which are facts. Anything else? We'll have your ideas. Another thing that you perhaps can add is that indigenous knowledge do have a metaphysical element. That's a fact about indigenous knowledge. Any ideas, colleagues? Another fact perhaps, and it's all around some of the questions that you ask, is whose indigenous knowledge is it? So all of us do have indigenous knowledge based on our cultural heritage. So it's not bounded to one particular cultural group. We all do have indigenous knowledge. So that is a fact. Oh, sorry, I see. Sorry, my thing was not on the right place. Therefore, I don't see any questions. IK is orally transmitted. It's IK is knowledge from any group of people. Dara Hoppes calls it knowledge apartheid. That's an interesting thing. In the African indigenous knowledge has been, we have placed too much importance on Western indigenous knowledge, so that is also a fact. Let me just see if there's something more. Indigenous knowledge has been ignored, underpinned, and silenced for too long, and there is clinical evidence that indigenous knowledge practices in terms of plant use are effective. So I think in terms of the facts, you can see that there might perhaps be some value in terms of indigenous knowledge if you look at the pure facts and no emotion connected to the facts itself. That brings us to the next head. We can just change mine here as well. And that is all about the emotions. So the feelings, how do you feel when you talk about indigenous knowledge and the curriculum? What is your hunch? What are your hunches about this? How do you feel about it? So let's see what's on the indigenous knowledge, perhaps African, but Western indigenous knowledge is very documented. That's perhaps also affects. There's a power dynamic implied here. We elicit knowledge to serve our own agendas. Not so. So yes, it can be a political thing as well, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why people don't like to talk or infuse indigenous knowledge, because of the hidden agendas. I'm trying fast, choosing first words, glad to be corrected, sorry. Perhaps African indigenous knowledge, but Western indigenous knowledge is very well documented, yes. Right now, I feel that we only care about indigenous knowledge when it serves us, medicine. We need to be inclusive. So that also will bring us actually to another head later where we can discuss this. I think a very important one that set people off about indigenous knowledge and the inclusion in the curriculum is the fact that there are some metaphysical elements. Prof. Josef referred to the koi sun where they use that bulb and when they dance and talk to their forefathers. So I think most people, when they talk about indigenous knowledge, think of the metaphysical and totally put them off. So, but the question that we need to ask is, how can we actually work around the fact that it do have metaphysical aspects? And later on, or if you as we go on with the discussion, you will actually see that there are overlaps in terms of indigenous knowledge and Western science as we know it, and that was also highlighted by Prof. Josef. It is not really shared, not published. I get angry when I see indigenous knowledge as the other and science as the authority. I think this is one of the reasons why we perhaps need to include indigenous knowledge to get rid of these stereotypes and things that we hold about indigenous knowledge. So the emotions run higher. And what about the next one, Francois? Optimism. So when you use the optimism hat, the learners get a chance to actually look at the sky. They can actually say anything. What are the benefits, the positives, the values? What are the ideas that you can use, the advantages, optimism, good points? How can we make it work? So what do you think in terms of optimism and the inclusion of indigenous knowledge in the science curriculum? So I'm waiting for some ideas. Can you see any benefits for this? You as teachers give me hope. We need to cultivate respect for indigenous knowledge in our learners. You are powerful. It can actually link to whose indigenous knowledge, because no one knows all indigenous knowledge. You might know some of your own culture, but you will have learners, diverse learners with different cultures and indigenous knowledge. And this will be a way to cultivate respect. I wish simply including indigenous knowledge in a lesson here and there was enough to rectify the systemic injustices which disenfranchise indigenous people on a continuous basis. It's a start, but it's far from enough. I think the good thing is if we can just start this and have discussions like this and the discourse on social media, I think it's a good way to at least talk and think about these things in order to implement it and have some differences in minds of learners, and it will go beyond that because they will have discussions with their parents as well. Indigenous knowledge can be used to build social bridges when we learn each other culture, which will also be, you will see, we touch already on some of the other heads. So what is a bad thing? The caution, the black hat. What do you see as challenges, negatives, problems, the downside of these, difficulties, dangers, why it may not be work, and what is wrong with this? So some ideas on inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in the science curriculum, the downsides. I think one downside is the fact that teachers are careful. They are a little bit, they don't want to use it because they're not sure whose Indigenous knowledge, what Indigenous knowledge to use. And of course, that is also an opportunity, because if you realize that, then I think that's the first thing. And then, you can actually work on that. Learners is enhanced if prior knowledge is activated. Learning is enhanced. Some other cautions. The overwhelming focus on science is the authority and can alienate learners from who want to learn more about Indigenous knowledge. One should know what you do to do such border crossing in the classroom. So how will you actually approach this? I think Francois also mentioned that you can include the learners in this and ask them, because they might have knowledge on their particular Indigenous knowledge, bring it to the classroom and make something of that. Do you realize, Francois, your entire comment here says that science is not indigenous knowledge? That is shocking. And then another one, we can include Indigenous knowledge without the necessary cultural sensitivity, and it can be performance of white civilization rather than transforming our schools. I think if you have hidden agendas, that's definitely a caution, a danger that it might happen. And the last one, you are all invited. Okay, so we are invited to the learning program. Thank you, Francois. Let's look at the green hat. You look at the same question from another perspective. How can we be creative? New creative ideas. What will be the solutions, proposals, possibilities? Any suggestions that you have in this regard? So let's see what you are writing here. What's your opinions? I think we touched already on some of these ideas where you can actually use your learners more to design and to bring it to the classroom. Use problem-based learning, as Prof. Josef indicated in his presentation. Indigenous knowledge will enhance self-directed learning, and we want learners to think for themselves, to solve problems, to actually manage their own learning. In order to that, this can be a great opportunity to do this. Indigenous technologies are great to provocations of new ideas in technology education. Interesting perspective. This is such a nice and constructive way to approach Indigenous knowledge as real knowledge. What if we let learners identify problems in the world which they would like to solve and connect them to first-hand Indigenous knowledge in their research? So yes, I think the green hat, let me read this one as the last one. Authentic material is what we are meant to use in the classroom according to CAPS. African Indigenous knowledge is authentic material. The challenge is, the black hat is the caution, we don't have it, and therefore we as teachers also need to be self-directed ourselves in order to realize our shortcomings, develop our own professional goals, and actually do something about it. And then the last one, the last head is where you actually look at the problem more holistically. What will your plan of action be? How can you manage the thinking process, the analysis? So this is also about how you can actually approach the whole problem or lesson to the learners. Any ideas on the blue hat that will be welcomed? So that is more the analysis part, structure, planning. Indigenous knowledge is valued and can often solve everyday problems better than conventional products on the market. Science fair topic, nice one. I love problem-based learning, project-based learning. Any comments? You're welcome to do so. We need to address equity and belonging in our classrooms on a far deeper level. If this person say on a far deeper level, what do you mean by that? Do you mean that if you include Indigenous knowledge as the way we propose it here, is that not enough? And there's another comment for the green net. Having discussions like this allow us to evaluate our biases and reform our values and therefore our discourse. I think if we realize these things, as in this last comment, I think we went a good way forward in terms of addressing these things. Yes, Francois, I think I'm more or less through the whole thing. So another thing that I perhaps can ask to you as teachers, what do you think about the Bono thinking aids as a teaching learning method that you can use to address especially controversial topics like the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge, and life sciences do have a lot of those. So I hope in terms of the discussion you have more or less a sense of whose Indigenous knowledge should we include. Is it a black thing? Who should lead the discussions and be scholars, and what your role as a teacher actually can be. Thank you, Francois, and thank you for listening to me, and thanks for all the comments that you made.
Thank you very much, colleagues. It's amazing to be part of discussions like this. And I really meant what I said in that comment of mine, that by being part of these type of discussions and not only including ourselves in our own echo chambers, it's important that we hear other people's discussions, that we really listen to what is said, not only to listen in order to respond, but in order to really understand, putting yourself in those shoes, reframing the way in which we think about the world, and then making that part of our life going forward. So thank you very much for everybody's comments. I'd like to move us into the question and answer part of our session. And I'm going to go to the first questions that's been upvoted. I'm going to ask if you have any more questions, feel free to add that to the Ask a Question button. That would be great. So let's start off with the first one. That's the one from Nikki. Nikki asks, how can we integrate Indigenous knowledge into the curriculum as a way of knowing rather than just facts and concepts? In technology education, we often see Indigenous products, but not the way in which those products were developed, i.e. the process behind that. I'm going to start off with Professor De Beer in answering that one, and then anybody else can jump in. And then, of course, if you've got an opinion on that, you're welcome to put that in chat.
Thank you, Francois. Nika, I think it's a very good question that you've asked. And, you know, I really enjoyed the conversations here on the site immensely. And I think, you know, there's a lot of wisdom that has been shared. And I know that one of the colleagues had this comment about one of the examples. I think it was the Dutch flowers that is very Eurocentric, which of course it is. And I then gave an example of a African example of onkusifon. It's a little flower in the Karoo. It's very dominant there. It's called the stinkruid in Afrikaans. And the local community have realized, and it's probably through trial and error, that if you put these little twigs with flowers in your shoes, you're not going to have smelly feet. And then there was actually a group of scientists who said, but let's go and investigate this. And what they did is they actually did clinical trials And the control was, and maybe Jaco can tell us, but you have commercial foot powder that, a powder that you put in your shoes so that your feet would not smell. But Jaco, odors are caused by bacteria. Am I right? And they've actually done tests to show that oncosyphon is 100 times more effective than the gold standard we use in terms of commercial foot powder. And this is a science investigation that kids can engage in. The other example that
It does look that Prof. de Beer's connection is a bit unstable there. While we wait for him to reconnect, Prof. Petersen or Jaco, if you want anything to add there?
I'm not familiar with that specific product or the organism, but typically odor is typically a mixture of skin bacteria but with shoes, for example, because your foot is enclosed, moisture retention is better from sweat. So fungi can start to play a role. So it can be a combination of antifungal and antibacterial products or properties of that compound. But again, like we do with the Kirby-Bauer, I demonstrated with bacteria, but the same principle applies when you test it against fungi as well. So that is quite an easy thing to explore as well in a classroom activity.
Sorry, Josef, we lost you there for a moment. If you want to complete your train of thought.
Sorry, colleagues. Yeah, I had to refresh. Now, what I was thinking is kids can do lovely investigations, for instance, to go and look at do a plant like oncosyphon actually help for smelly feet? It's a very African example. It is going to take them through problem-based learning of designing an experiment, and really tapping on the work that Dr. Jaco has shared with us. Another example is in Guyana, they've realized that Lipia javanica, the fever tree, is used to as an insect repellent, and it's far better than citronella oil that we all use in the game parks to keep mosquitoes away. And they've actually started to use the alkaloids in this plant to make candles, and actually made a living for our whole community by commercializing this product. And I think, Dr. Audrey, I would really actually love to hear her views, but in a country where we have such high unemployment, I think this indigenous knowledge also holds so many entrepreneurial activities for communities to explore, utilizing science to also improve the quality of our lives.
Thank you very much for that. Let's move on to a question by Lindsay. Is there really a lack of Indigenous knowledge, or do the voices of Indigenous knowledge lack access to platforms to share their knowledge? This was asked very early on in today's webinar, but I do think it's a very valid one to still try and answer here. Is there really a lack of Indigenous knowledge, or do the voices of Indigenous knowledge lack access to platforms such as this one to share their knowledge?
Francois, can I say something? I also want to link it to how might we shift the perspective on Indigenous knowledge. I think I will say that there's not a lack of knowledge. I think it's more a question of our own thoughts on these things, our perspectives on Indigenous knowledge. If you have a negative perspective about Indigenous knowledge, as it was, as we learned it, as we grow up, and somebody talk about hundreds of years, then that is the context in which it's actually placed and seen as not valuable. I think if we can see realize the value of Indigenous knowledge systems in all cultures, then you will get opportunities to talk about it, and that will change perspectives. If a teacher look at the CAPS document and say and see you need to include Indigenous knowledge in in your teaching, and that teacher is negative about Indigenous knowledge, he or she will never see the possibilities when they arise wherever you go. So if your perspective and your attitude is open, then I think you will Indigenous knowledge will be more available, because you're open to see these things, and of course bring it into your classroom. Yeah.
I'd like to touch on what Lindsay said in the comments there, where she said the webinar opened with the words, "We need to broaden the base of Indigenous knowledge through action research in Indigenous communities." And that's one of the things that this today's session already assisted me on, is being very careful with the discourse we use and the words that we use, because it does reflect our values, it does reflect our bias. So what is important here is that when we say we want to broaden the base of knowledge, is more, and I agree with Lindsay on this, it's access to the knowledge that we need to broaden, and we need to create platforms where people can get more access and learn from each other, because the Indigenous knowledge exists. And I agree with one of the comments that it existed long before science, and I believe that's one of the other comments or questions that's made, is it comes down to epistemology. It's the way of knowing, and the way of knowing before science stood for millennia. And science is a new way of knowing. And I don't think it's fair that science would become the authority and saying that this is the only way of knowing. And now we need to breach that gap, and we need to rectify this. And a platform like this is one of those. And I'm not saying this is the best platform. It is at least a platform. But I agree with the sentiment of many of the comments, is that we need I also want to say dramatic reform in the way in which we teach. But Prof. Petersen, you say, you mentioned a very pertinent thing. If the teacher, who is the critical element in this, if the teacher is the person that touches the learners in the classroom, then if they are not open to broadening their horizons, if they only approach their lessons from a scientific worldview, then including Indigenous knowledge won't be even an option for them. Okay, let's look at the next one. This is one from Kerry Ann. Kerry Ann says, teachers weigh in more in terms of having a curriculum that has a happy medium between global topics as well as ones that cater to our Indigenous knowledge as South Africans. We need to know where we come from to know where we are going. That's a very good point made by it, and I'd like to open the floor to our presenters on maybe adding to that comment.
Francois, if I can respond, I really so agree with you. I think that's a very, very valid point. And Neal and I actually had this discussion this morning. You know, I think we don't always celebrate what we have in this country. You know, I think there's this discourse in South Africa of always focusing on the negative and forgetting the wonderful things that we need to celebrate. And, you know, in the Karoo, for instance, in the Carnarvon area, we sit with this juxtaposition of the most advanced technology in the world with the square kilometer array telescopes, which is far more advanced, I think, than NASA. And then we sit with the oldest Indigenous knowledge system in the world, the sun. And, you know, the work that I do in the Northern Cape amongst descendants of Khoisan people is that they are in denial about where they come from, their heritage of being Khoisan. And I think that is incredibly sad, and that is because of the injustices in our country in terms of our political past, where this Indigenous knowledge might have been labeled than less desired than Western values, maybe. And I think the work that we can do as teachers is to install this pride in our cultural heritage, and, you know, especially in the Northern Cape, to let the descendants of the Khoisan people, the Indigenous knowledge holders, really feel proud about this wonderful heritage. It's the oldest Indigenous system in the world. And, you know, there's some people lived in such harmony with the environment. And I think we in modern society can learn such a great deal if I look at how we pollute and destroy our planet. So I really think it's, someone mentioned, we also in this discourse need to think of social justice, and I can't agree more. We need to really look at also embracing this Indigenous knowledge, because it's part of who we are as a rainbow nation.
And I think Lee hit the nail on the head with a comment there, and I agree with her in the fact that maybe we should just start calling it knowledge, because implying that it's indigenous already brings in a bias on who is the observer. It's this othering that we spoke about previously. Somebody said it in the comments. It is this othering that's happening in the community, which is not fair. It's not equitable, because if you are part of a society where you've been looked down upon because your indigenous knowledge or the knowledge you've gathered is seen as inferior to others, that of course becomes a very big political issue. So I agree with that. Maybe just normalizing everybody's knowledge is a good idea.
Francois, can I perhaps say something on a personal matter in terms of that? Many colored people really don't see themselves as have roots from the Khoisan people, because it just have that negative connotation, and as Josef mentioned, the history. So if I can just think of my own family, if I will have a discussion about that we have a Khoisan blood in us, most of my family will definitely not disagree, and they will actually will be perhaps nasty to me and say, how can I say something like that? So if you bring in these things, it will bring out the value of the person themselves, of your own indigenous knowledge, and not just from other people, because we need to learn from the cultures and practices of other people as well, but we need to value it from your own perspective. And if you don't know it or don't want to see it or grow up in a house where it's a no-go, then this can be opportunity where you can find your roots and really understand who you are and where you're going.
Francois, may I just add to what Neal said, and I also look at Lady Westner's comment about not just looked down upon, but silenced, the disenfranchised. In the apartheid years, we had a Suppression of Witchcraft Act. And if African people wanted to go to a traditional healer, they could have been imprisoned, because, that was an infringement of the Suppression of Witchcraft Act, which tells you about Western society that actually dismissed this knowledge and said, the moment that you go and not go to a Western doctor, but to a traditional healer, you are actually practicing witchcraft. And I mean, what a shame, what a insult. And I do think, the first thing the first step in recovery is to acknowledge this and to realize that indigenous knowledge and cultural practices has been marginalized for far too long in our country.
Absolutely. And I think that the function of a project such as this one is exactly this, that let's start curating the knowledge that does exist, and let's give access to people, to the holders of this knowledge, and we give them access to platforms, and we ensure that we have more of these kinds of discussions. Colleagues, I'd like to thank you. We are at the end of today's session. Final call, a last call. If you'd like to be part of our community, if you'd like to be part of this project, and you'd like to receive notifications on our following discussions, because I really hope this wasn't the first and the only discussion that we'll have on a platform like this. But please make sure that you click on the button there that says be notified on WhatsApp, and just send us your name so that we can add you to our database. But thank you very much to everybody for joining us today. Looking forward to the next one. We'll definitely be sending you the slides, and you'll receive the recording. Until next time, when we have our next one, it is let me answer that last one. What is this project, Francois? It's specifically, I'm referring to the STEM Teachers Without Borders. It's one of the directives of this project, is exactly to curate this knowledge and give access and give a platform for it. I do also acknowledge there are other platforms, and it's important that we do collaborate with each other so that we can broaden the reach of it. But until next time, thank you to everybody that joined us. We'll see you with our next intervention, or let me rather say our next event, and looking forward to the final part of this year. Stay super.